There's a scene that many people who've read the Mishnah confront. I mean, they see it. It's really in the very beginning of the Mishnah in Brachot. It's not tucked away in some obscure place, but it's right there at the top. Anybody checking out Mishnah for the first time probably is learning about when to say Shema, and boom, there's a story. There's an incident that happens, right? And so in your book, you actually quote someone else's description of this story. It's on page 209, and he actually is quoting from, there we go. He's actually quoting from someone else's description.
Moshe Simon Shoshan.
There we go. Him in his description of this Mishnah. He says, I have loved this tale ever since I first read it as a child. I picture Rabban Gamaliel's son stumbling through the back door of their house in the wee hours of the morning, hoping not to disturb their sleeping family. To their surprise, they find their father at the kitchen table in his dressing gown, deep in study. The sight of their father reminds them that the festivities have distracted them from their obligation to accept the yoke of heaven through the recitation of the Shema. Their father looks up from his book with a mixture of concern and rebuke. He informs them that it is still possible to rectify their lax behavior, provided that the night has not yet ended. So I mean, with some adjustments, I basically see this story in the same way.
Yeah, I mean, I add in the book that I always had I remember the first time I encountered this tale, I always thought that it was a little bit different and this is where we'll get to this, right? This is why I take the literal meaning of Beit Mishtas much more seriously. Is imagine them coming home with a little bit of drink in them, and they bump into their dad, and instead of imagining him deep in study, I always imagined him as the scene in sitcoms where they try and sneak in and the dad turns on the lamp and they're waiting, the parents are waiting for them. Yeah. And then I thought that they did the smart thing. Maybe this is more insight into me as a kid, right? The smart thing to say, how do I distract my parents? Oh, I'll ask a halachic question. I'll ask a legal question. And then dad takes the bait. And, instead of being like, well, that's an interesting halachic question. Well, as you know, I have Puskin, and then he continues on. Right. So that's the way I always read it. But this was a moment when I read Mr. Rosh Hashan's book where I read that. I'm like, yes, someone else, I never articulated that. Someone else has this vision of it. And the other cool thing is, you're right, this is in the first couple lines of the Mishnah. This is not an obscure random thing in Uksin or something, right? This is right there. I think if you were to ask a lot of people who've spent any time studying text, they probably have had some vision of how this went down in their head.
Yeah, right. And it's also amusing that they arrive to their parents. It's not just like their own houses. Like, it's literally, they're still young enough to be under their parents' own roof, right? So they're young enough that they're not that, but they're old enough that they're out drinking. Right. So now the fascinating thing is, it's like one of these things of like, how often are people up past midnight and they're not drinking, right? like of course they were at some party and they were probably drinking and they were stumbling in past midnight. Like, right. That's like you mentioned, you can picture it on sitcoms. Like, it doesn't require a crazy amount of imagination where you have to like picture yourself in a different time and place. Like, that's something that you can easily transpose into our own contemporary culture.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And again, this is one of the things we both share is obviously this love of texts about rabbinic drinking or Jewish drinking in your framing, is that it's not obscure. Like, that's the point that we both have talked about before. Right? These are not obscure texts. We can find some obscure ones, but this is right up front, and this is part of a text that anyone who's spent more than a minute studying rabbinic literature has come across this text, right? It's a basic starting point. And people just read past that. They're reading past it is part of it because it's so present, but also they're reading past it means, I would also argue, they're missing a lot of what's going on there.
I like that. And also, there are two other things. One is we're going to get into the translation aspect, and the other is that there's no value. There's not like a negative moral valence going on. Like, Rabban Gamaliel doesn't say to his sons, like, you guys, you should have been home earlier. He just said, oh, you guys thought it was only until the midnight. Actually, you can do it all the way. Like, he's not upset that they were out so late, that they were necessarily out drinking or necessarily where they were. It was just simply like, you guys still have a chance.